Chapter 7. Summer passed in relative peace, Ishlamar content, his mind hazy as Tokog maintained the spell's control over his thoughts, though he had begun to let up slightly. The Elmeih did not receive any more visitors, and continued to remain secluded on their mountain just the way they wanted. The days came and went, each one passing by with nothing notable about them. Reflecting on it years later, Ishlamar had decided that he was grateful for those days of calm and quiet. Then, one day, everything changed. The morning had started out just like any other. Ishlamar had gone on a hunt with Tokog's son, Malvir, who had been given opportunities to use Ishlamar for various tasks more frequently. He was aware of Tokog's intention to pass him on to Malvir in the near future. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. Not that he had a choice in the matter. Malvir was harsher than Tokog, and far more aggressive in his punishments. He had no room to complain, though. Tokog was one of the Elmeih. He could not be wrong. If he felt that Ishlamar could best serve by belonging to Malvir, well, he would do his best. He was standing behind Malvir, waiting as he discussed a potential trade for the hide of the deer they had caught with another member of the Elmeih that Ishlamar did not know the name of. He rarely tried to learn any of their names, just the faces. It was only the members of Tokog's family that he bothered with. His ears twitched when he heard a scream, shortly followed by the rest of his head turning in the same direction. It had come from further up the path. There was another, catching Malvir's attention, as well as the attention of those around them. Ishlamar flinched when he heard a loud yelp. That was "Ralaskamar?" he whispered, already taking a step towards the sounds before breaking into a run. He heard Malvir yelling at him from behind, but he ignored him. There was a strange clarity in his head. The fog that had clouded his thoughts felt less suffocating. He could think, and something was wrong with Ralaskamar. He cared more about him than any member of the Elmeih, no matter what the voice screaming inside his head claimed. As he reached the top of the hill, Ishlamar quickly looked around to figure out what was happening. The first thing he noticed was Estelle. She was on her knees near the bottom of the temple steps, her eyes blazing with fury. Her left hand was pressed against the back of her neck, where thick, reddish-black blood steadily flowed down her shoulder and between her fingers. The woman who he recognized as Sendavir's owner was kneeling next to Estelle and trying to help stop the bleeding. It did not seem to be working. The woman looked panicked, screaming something in that unfamiliar language all the Elmeih seemed to know, but that he had still not figured out. He searched for Ralaskamar's familiar golden scales and spotted him lying in the nearby grass. The area around him was charred, as were some of his scales. He was struggling to get onto his feet, his lips drawn back in a vicious snarl, his pupils thin slits of black surrounded by bright gold. "Ralaskamar!" he shouted at the same time as he let out a bark, darting toward his fallen friend. Something cold caught his back paws. Ishlamar stumbled, slamming into the ground. He growled, twisting around to try and free his paws. Ice covered his paws and, as he watched, moved up his legs. He was quick to grab hold of it in his jaws, trying to bite himself free. Malvir caught up with him only seconds later, dropping to his knees next to Ishlamar and grabbing onto the sides of his face. Ishlamar snarled at him and tried biting his hands, but was unable to reach them. "Let go of me!" he shouted, his front claws swiping at the man. Malvir did not let go, hissing as the claws scraped across his skin. He glared at Ishlamar. Malvir's grip on his head tightened. He felt pressure inside of his skull. The voice that was him, but not him, growing louder. Ishlamar's eyes widened as he realized what was going on. He stopped trying to claw Malvir and began jerking his head. "No!" he barked. He had just gotten free. "Get out of my head!" He could hear shouting behind him as more of the Elmeih arrived to deal with Estelle and Relascamar, but the only thing he was able to focus on was his head and Malvir. The link that had bound him to Tokag was being destroyed. It hurt, like daggers gouging into his mind and ripping it apart. Ishlamar slowly stopped fighting, small whimpers escaping his mouth as he began to slump to the ground. The only thing holding him up was Malvir's hands on his face, and that too was ripped away very suddenly. With the support gone, he fully dropped to the ground, his cheek pressing against the dirt as he stared blankly up at the two figures standing over him. Tokag had arrived, jerking Malvir away from Ishlamar. He looked angry, so angry. He was shouting something at Malvir, but Ishlamar was unable to make out the words. Everything looked and sounded a little hazy, almost as if he were underwater. He knew he needed to get up. Something had been wrong. Was wrong? He could not tell if the threat had passed, but Tokag needed to be protected. No, not Tokag. Malvir. Ishlamar squeezed his eyes shut, trying to stop the shaking of his body that he could feel but not control. Something had happened. Malvir had hurt him. He must have deserved it. Malvir would not do something without a purpose. Why was Tokag so angry? Ishlamar's eyes opened again to see them both staring down at him. The ground around him was cold and wet. He thought he remembered there being ice, but it was not there anymore. Just a puddle. With still trembling paws, he carefully rolled onto his stomach and began standing up. Malvir knelt down, drawing Ishlamar's attention to him. With slow, shaky steps, he closed the short distance between them and pressed his head against the man's palm, still making small whimpers of pain. From behind Malvir, he could see Tokag watching with anger and sadness? That was strange. Ishlamar was protecting the man's son. He should have been happy. His ears flattened against his head. "I'm sorry," he softly said. Malvir did not respond. He looked away, meeting his father's disapproving gaze. Ishlamar silently stood between Tokag and Malvir, listening to the conversation taking place around him. The Elmeih had gathered to figure out what to do next. Estelle had been killed. It had been 2 days since it happened, and they all seemed to disagree on what happened now. Ishlamar really didn't care, as long as Malvir was safe.
That's it then. After everything we've gone through, you just want to give up.
One of the sorcerers gathered said. Ishlamar saw Tokag moving, but it was Malvir who spoke next.
"Nothing will change if we continue to hide here,"
he muttered.
"People are afraid of magic when they have no reason to be. We need to be amongst others outside of our group and show them."
Tokag nodded approvingly at his son's words.
Just because we scatter does not mean everyone has to leave either. My wife and I plan to remain here. You set up a home and are happy. Anyone who is afraid of traveling out into the world, is too young or too old to do so, is welcome to remain as well.
Nor the Shizi. Estelle underestimated Relascamar. Look where that got her. We need to get rid of them.
It was her own fault.
Tokag spoke up.
She pushed him too far. She knew the spell had limits. It is her own fault that Relascamar snapped.
And what about your own lapse in control?
He glanced around.
I'm not blind yet. I can see you're not following Malvir around like a lost pup. If this hasn't proven my point to you all, I don't know what will. They are clearly too dangerous to be left alive.
Tokag stepped forward, preparing to argue, but the man shot him a glare and continued before Tokag could say anything.
You warned us of this when you helped make them, did you not? Don't you dare argue with me, when you were adamant that they be executed from the start.
Tokag sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose between 2 fingers.
I remember, but my argument for execution was made when they were still humans.
He frowned.
That is no longer the case. and we are all responsible for it. It would be irresponsible to change our minds now and slaughter them. And yes, I lost control of Ishlamar. It was partially on purpose, though. Malvir is taken over now, forcefully and in my least preferred method, but it is done. Ishlamar is safe to be around.
What about Relaskamar?
Tokog's brow raised, confused.
What about him? He's asleep, isn't he?
Yes. But we're not just going to leave him like that, are we?
Why not? He is not hurting anything like that. He won't be waking up for a few years anyway, even if he lives. I'm not entirely confident that the lack of food and water won't kill him, regardless of the spell's influence. If he does make it, and we are still here, we can deal with it then. If not, what does it even matter? He will not be leaving.
Tokog shrugged.
I suppose you have a point.
The man muttered, frowning. There were murmurs, but no one spoke loud enough to be heard. Ishlamar stood on top of a large boulder, a cool breeze ruffling the fur on his neck. Sendavir stood on the ground below him. The moon glowed above them, full and bright. It made her scales shimmer. He did not attempt to hold back the content rumbling in his chest. Having her with him felt right. He had not forgotten their past. He knew they had once been human and together, but it felt like so long ago and irrelevant. They were Shizi now, not humans, and the only thing that mattered was Malvir. Despite this, he was still happy to have her at his side again. Did she feel the same? He hoped so. It had been 3 days since the Elmeih had decided to split. Tokog had tried to convince the rest of the Elmeih to keep the Shizi together, but only one person had heeded his request. It had ended up with Malvir receiving command of Sendavir, however, much to Ishlamar's appreciation. Malvir had come to the decision to leave only a few days later. This did not bother Ishlamar. He was concerned about the fact they were leaving in the middle of the night, however. But Malvir knew best. He would not question it. His ears twitched, picking up the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. He turned his head, spotting Tokog and his family approaching. Ishlamar carefully climbed off the rock, gently nudging Sendavir towards them. She did not make a sound, instead silently turning and following him over to the group. Besides a quick glance from Tokog, no one reacted to Ishlamar and Sendavir's approach.
Be careful,
Tokog said quietly, one hand resting on Malvir's shoulder. Galadriel nodded and stayed quiet. She had already said what she wanted to her son. There was nothing more she needed to say.
I will. I'll have Ishlamar and Sendavir with me. We will be fine.
Malvir smiled as he said it, adjusting the pack on his shoulder. He was quiet for a moment, thinking, as Tokog removed his hand from Malvir's shoulder.
Is this it then?
Yes.
Tokog quietly responded.
Take care of yourself. And them.
Tokog gestured to Ishlamar and Sendavir. Both Shizi stared at him, Ishlamar's ears twitching. Malvir watched for a moment before taking in a deep breath, readjusting his pack one last time.
I will. Ishlamar, Sendavir, let's go.
He turned away, only looking back once to make sure the two Shizi were following. Ishlamar glanced between Malvir and Tokog. Sendavir had already started walking. He hesitated, catching Tokog's gaze. They stared at each other in silence, Ishlamar's tail slowly brushing across the grass behind him. His head tilted to the side, and he barked before following Malvir and Sendavir. I forgive you, Tokog, he quietly thought to himself. He wasn't quite sure exactly what he was forgiving, but it felt right.